Does the Quran talk about palm trees, grapes, fruits? Assalamu alaikum. Today we're going to look at a very interesting masal, example, that we find in Surah Al-Kahf in this particular ayat. Now, from the surface level reading that we do, it seems to be talking about two men who are talking about two gardens, and we are meant to draw understanding from this masal. What is that masal? How do we really understand it? Here on the right hand side, this is the passage that we're going to be talking about and looking at. In particular, today, we're going to look at two main questions. Question number one, as I said in the very beginning, what is the takeaway from this masal in Surah Al-Kahf? Are we really talking about two people who just happen to be beside two gardens talking about grapes and palm trees and rivers and water and fruit? Or is there something else that's happening out there? And what is the message that we are meant to derive from it to better understand our connection with the divine? And secondly, I would also like to explore and critique this very daring proposition that has been presented, that one of the two rajul, or men in this particular example, is Rasul Eisa ibn Maryam. Is Eisa ibn Maryam one of these two rajul? Let's dispose ourselves of our predispositions, our internal biases, and look at this with clear, fresh, virgin eyes. Let's begin. A little bit about the structure. We are going to be using my word file because frankly I think to look at this example, this masal in its entirety, is way easier for us to work off a word file compared to a PowerPoint presentation. So what I've done in front of you is shared the word file that I worked off, and the first thing I've done is I've just put all of those 13 ayat in front of you, and I've also marked some of the questions that I had in my mind when I reread this particular masal, not once, not twice, but a great number of times. On surface, it seems very simple. You just read through it and you go, okay, there are two people, they are beside a garden, rather two gardens, they're from grapes, and there's some palm trees, and they're talking about fruit. Well, if you start thinking about what's really happening in there, the more you think, the more you realize it's not A, as straightforward as you might have liked, but B, that there's a lot more happening beneath the surface that we just don't get if you just happen to pass by that. And as I said, there's a fantastic contention that's also been made that one of these rajul is Eisa ibn Maryam. So that is also something, as I said, we're going to be talking and looking at as we go through this masal in this file. To show you some of the questions that I had when I started looking and investigating this particular masal, first of all and straight away, when the Quran says, وَضْرِبْ لَهُمْ مَثَلًا, strike for them an example. Who is the they, lahum? Who are these people? Rajulain, who are these two men? Are they even men that we're looking at? And if so, who are those two men? جَعَلْنَا لِأَحَدِهِمَا, we made for one of them. Okay, what about the other? janatain min a'nab, did two jannat get created of grapes? وَحَفَفْنَاهُمَا بِنَخْلٍ, and were there palm trees that we're talking about? Ukulaha, that the janatain, that these two gardens, they're giving out their fruits as well. Is that what we're talking about? Naharan, is that a river? Is that a physical river that we see out there, which is being referred to here? Then there's thamar, fruit. Are we talking about fruit from those gardens? And this is quite an interesting one, this little pattern here. وَهُوَ يُحَاوِرُهُ. So if already we know that somebody is talking, فَقَالَ لِصَاحِبِهِ, then what is the value, what is the semantic value of وَهُوَ يُحَاوِرُهُ هُنَا? Why is the same thing being repeated twice? If we cut off this little part here, وَهُوَ يُحَاوِرُهُ, and we just said فَقَالَ لِصَاحِبِهِ أَنَا أَكْثَرُ مِنْكَ مَالًا, then what did we lose out? If we lost nothing, then this was superfluous. But this is not the style of the Quran. Quran is extremely precise in what words it uses. So what is the value? What is the reason that we find this particular pattern here? Continue going, what does nafara mean here? Then the next ayah is a really puzzling one. وَدَخَلَ جَنَّتَهُ, someone is entering his Jannah. Who is entering? And why are we talking about one Jannah here? What happened to the other Jannah that we were shown in the very beginning? We're two Jannat, Jannatain. Suddenly we're talking about just one Jannah. What happened here? Then وَمَا أَظُنُّ السَّاعَةَ, why is the as-sa'a be talked about when all we're really referring to here are two gardens? What is the consequence here? What is the connection in here? Again, وَهُوَ يُحَاوِرُهُ, same question as in before. If we cut that off, do we lose anything? If we don't, what is the value of this? lakinna. Again, it's a very weird spelling of lakin. Why is this word written out like so? If we continue on, وَلَوْلَا إِذْ دَخَلْتَ جَنَّتَكَ. Same thing. Who is the one talking to whom, and why is one Jannah being talked about? مَا شَاءَ اللَّهُ. What is the reason behind someone suggesting to the other, you should have said مَا شَاءَ اللَّهُ? Now here, something very interesting happens. A person is repeating the claim that was made by the other person, but the wording has changed. In the beginning, the term that was used was nafara. Here it has changed to walada. Why? What is the rationale behind it? Again, jannatika, who is being talked about? What jannah? From whom? By who? If we continue on, فَلَن تَسْتَطِيعْ لَهُ. What is the who here? وَأُحِيطَ بِثَمَرِهِ. Are we talking about fruits here? Hunalika. What does hunalika mean compared to huna, for example? So you can see already that if you really start digging past the superficial layer of this particular masal, you begin to tease out a few questions that should make you stop. If you want to really ponder the Quran, really engage the Quran, then these are some of the questions that caught my eye. And I'm sure if there was anybody else who was to pay attention to these, they'll probably find more questions than I had when you go through and read through in the middle of Surah Al-Kahf. What we're now going to do is we're going to go through every single ayah one by one. And straight away, I apologize to those who will be watching from a mobile phone, because I know and I can already preempt some of those concerns and questions and queries that people will have, as in I can't see what was being shown. I really have no other better way to show my research than sharing my word file. What I will try and do is zoom in as much as I can, but if I can't zoom in, then I would encourage you to re-watch particular sections that catch your eye on a desktop screen. By the way, if you are on an Android phone, I know that on YouTube you can zoom in, so maybe also try that. But anyway, let's start. What we will be now looking at are all of the ayat one by one, and what you have in front of you are 5 columns. On the left hand side, I'll be giving a play-by-play, basically what's really happening in this ayah. Then in the next table, I'll be presenting a few propositions, some deeper meanings that I am deriving from this particular ayat, and how is it advancing the story of this masal. On this particular column, you'll find the actual ayah of the Quran, and right beside it, you will find my humble translation of this ayah. On the right hand side are some discussion points, some things that I've observed, some things that I want to talk about, some things that I don't quite think are valuable enough as propositions, but these are just pointers for those who want to take this research further. So without further ado, let's dive in. The first ayah of this masal is this. وَاضْرِبْ لَهُمْ مَثَلًا رَجُلَيْنِ جَعَلْنَا لِأَحَدِهِمَا جَنَّتَيْنِ مِنْ أَعْنَابٍ وَحَفَفْنَاهُمَا بِالنَّخْلِ وَجَعَلْنَا بَيْنَهُمَا زَرْعًا. Translation: and strike for them an example of 2 authoritative people entities. We established for one of them 2 veiled heavens containing easy to reach outcomes, learnings, and we bounded these 2 with the structure signposts, and we placed between the 2 a harvest producing mechanism. Let's look at some of the propositions and why I'm saying what I'm saying. Proposition number 1. This example, masal, is for those who amanu, as in those who have been spreading peace. What you'll also see is my current level of comfort, certainty that I think this proposition has based on what I've looked at so far. We'll talk about this more, this proposition and the others, when I go to the right hand side and discuss the notes in further detail. Number 2. Rajulain are 2 authoritative people, forces, and not necessarily men. I'm really certain of that, and it's a topic I've covered thoroughly in the Urdu series. Who haven't watched it, called Quran or Aurat series. 3. In the first ayah, the one we just looked at, there is no clear marking reference for one of the 2 Rajulain to point to Rasul Eisa ibn Maryam. Up until this point in the surah, there has been no reason to say that this surah, or this masal in particular, refers to Eisa ibn Maryam. Again, I have a great deal of discussion to come on that when we go to the discussion section. Number 4. Quran's terms are not exclusively references to physical objects, but instead they are mafhum of themes. Now again, this is something we've covered throughout the channel, basically. Number 5. Jannah in the Quran is a mafhum that covers themes like a place of bliss, knowledge, contentment, strength, power that is hidden from the uninitiated, unaware, incapable, unwarranted. Again, we'll talk more about Jannah as the other ayat come up. Number 6. Maryam and Zakaria are not the two janatain in this ayah. They are not. And why do I say that is something we'll talk about on the right hand side. Number 7. The Quran's nakhil, an-nakhl, inab, a'nab are not reference to physical things. Again, we'll talk about this on the right hand side. 8. The two jannatain given to person A have a structure and designed to keep producing results. 9. There is a reason two jannah are being mentioned instead of any other number. Again, I'll talk about this on the right hand side as well. 10th. Although person B, remember there are two rajul, if we take them to be people, person A and person B. Although person B is not mentioned as possessing a jannah, he is still authoritative by being a rajul. Now let's break some of these propositions down, because I know there will be a few people who will be asking questions. They will have a lot of comments at this point. So try and preempt all of that. What I've done is I have facilitated a section on the right that we're going to go to now to look at some of these propositions in great detail and try and answer some of those comments and questions and queries from people in an academic manner. Before I go any further, let me remind all of those who have been watching me from before, or present a disclaimer to those who are watching me for the first time. All that is being presented here is my understanding of the mushaf. Any critique that I make to someone's work is not a critique of that person or their knowledge or their intents behind what they're doing. But it is, if it does apply, it is for a particular aspect of their research. Remember, we are all humans, aren't we? We can all make mistakes, and disagreements, if there are any, should remain academic. An alternative explanation for this particular masal was requested by the presenter of a theory that I call Eisa ibn Maryam in this masal theory, and as such, that counter explanation and alternative explanation is being offered. As I said in the very beginning, this is my understanding of the mushaf. I can make mistakes. I am no more than a mere student who has been pondering the Quran for a very little period of time. So it is very possible that I could be wrong, I could be incorrect, I could be inaccurate, or I may not have penetrated deep enough to some of those terms as to what, or the meanings that we should be deriving. Maybe I haven't derived them yet, and that is completely understandable. All that I can say is that what I understand, I offer to the best of my ability as of right now. I offer this with my genuine sincerity. This is my understanding as of this point, and I present to you based upon the research that I have done so far. I do not force this on anybody. I do not mean to demean anybody. I don't ask anyone to take my fahm as the last word. It is merely a student's work being presented to hopefully power other people to tear this apart, but builds upon maybe some nuggets that I could have found as part of my looking on this particular ayat. Having clarified all of that, now let's tackle the first and the most thorny question of them all. Was Maryam a Jannah? Is Maryam a Jannah in the Quran? Is Zakaria another Jannah? And thus are those two part of this particular masal. Is Eisa ibn Maryam, is he one of the two rajulain in this masal? Now a claim has been made that Maryam is an indirect marking for Jannah, and thus by extension Zakaria is the other one. By equating those two to be thus, and another argument is made that says, now one of the two rajul in this masal is Rasul Eisa ibn Maryam. Now that claim, this masal, is taken as primary support to support a really serious charge against Eisa ibn Maryam. I don't need to go any further, and I'm very deliberately keeping myself contained to this particular masal only. This particular masal has been derived and understood to be this in order to lay a charge against Eisa ibn Maryam. And my job is really just to see, do I find, as an honest student, sincere student of the Quran, any justification for taking Maryam as a Jannah, Zakaria as another Jannah, and Eisa ibn Maryam as one of the two rajulain in this masal? The logical proposition of that argument that is made goes something like this, which I have captured. Let's go through that argument point by point to see how it's built up before we start critiquing it. A. It is claimed that in 2350, which is this particular ayah, وَجَعَلْنَا ibn Maryam وَأُمَّهُ آيَةً وَآوَيْنَاهُمَا إِلَى رَبْوَةٍ ذَاتِ قَرَارٍ وَمَعِينٍ. It is claimed that in that ayah, Maryam and a son of hers are an ayah, whether it's taken together or individually. B, that Maryam took shelter in a rabwah, which is the same ayah that we just looked at. C, this is where things start getting interesting, that because a Jannah is being talked about in a rabwah, and rabwah is only used in one other place in the mushaf, and it faced hardship there and offered 2 multiples of its fruits, this ayah, therefore that Jannah is a metaphorical representation of Maryam. So Jannah A equals Maryam. How does that go? Let me show it to you visually as well. So it said that because Ibn Maryam and Ummuhu, they were taken to a rabwah, and the same word rabwah only appears in one more place in the Quran, which is this one. And because this one is now talking about a Jannah, then that Jannah that is in rabwah is Maryam. Hence Jannah A in this masal that we just read is Maryam. Point number D, that because Zakaria was a source of support for Maryam, thus he too by extension was a Jannah. So he is now Jannah B. So janatain, one of the first 2 Jannat is Maryam and the other Jannah is Zakaria. Point number E, because of C and D, as in those 2 assertions, the janatain mentioned in this ayah are Maryam and Zakaria. F, therefore it follows that one of the 2 rajulain is Rasul Eisa ibn Maryam. So this is how I've understood that particular argument to have been built. Now let's look at some of the problems before we start really critiquing the above argument. Let me offer a counter evidence. I'll call it 1. Word-term associations do not always link to the same referent. Case in point, rajulain. What do I mean? We find the motif of 2 rajul used as a masal in the Quran many times, 3 times at least. All 3 times they're presented as contrasts to each other. Whenever we find a masal where we find 2 rajul, we tend to find them as contrast to each other. And in these contrasts we find a unifying theme. This is how they're being used by the Quran. Now whether, and this is where we have a choice. Someone who's reading these amthal of the Quran, when he finds those 2 rajulain, they could take those 2 rajulain as unnamed individuals who may not have been named directly, but they were real people who lived in history at one point in time. Or someone could take them as positive and negative energies that reside within us, or as variables for 2 authoritative entities that oppose each other, and variations on this theme. I don't really find a problem with that particular approach. But what I do find very interesting is that these ayat that contain these masal, as in 2 rajulain, they do not talk about the same target. It is not possible to say that in all of these 3 examples where we find rajulain, they're all talking about the same targets. Depending upon the context, the people, if you take them as people, that they're referring to cannot be the same people. They have to be different. Hence, just because we find terms that come up all the time together does not necessarily link them to the same referent. We'll talk about this more as we go on. So question, if the same word appears at 2 different places within the mushaf, does it have to refer to the same object, person, referent? The answer is no. Well, what if the linkage appears twice or maybe more than twice? The answer is still no. Greater instances of linkages and the associated word cloud increases the probability of a link. That there is a chance that because we are seeing not just those 2 terms coming up together, but that there are other patterns and other concepts that are also coming together, we got increasing confidence that there is linkage between the 2, but that is still not 100%. We should be really careful before we say we've got something that is firm, that is unquestionable, and then make further claims out of that assumption. And as part of what I've been talking about, here are the other 2 circumstances within the Quran where we find the 2 rajul being used as a masal in the Quran. The first one is وَضَرَبَ اللَّهُ مَثَلًا رَجُلَيْنِ أَحَدُهُمَا أَبْكَمْ لَا يَقْدِرُ عَلَى شَيْءٍ وَهُوَ كَلٌّ عَلَى مَوْلَاهُ, or up until the end of the ayah. And the other one is ضَرَبَ اللَّهُ مَثَلًا رَجُلًا فِيهِ شُرَكَاء مُتَشَاكِسُونَ وَرَجُلٌ سَلَمًا لِرَجُلٍ Can we force Eisa ibn Maryam and Yahya on these two circumstances as well? Just because rajulain appears in one ayah or in one particular section, and we take that to point to two people, Eisa ibn Maryam and Yahya, can we take those and apply them onto the other instance where we find rajul as a masal as well? And if we can't, and I don't think it works, we must pause and revisit the assumption that just because a word appears in two different places, it has to mean it's talking to the same referent, or it's the same, it is a variable for the same object in the end. We'll talk more about this as we go on, so if you haven't quite caught on, that's completely okay, that's fine. We'll continue and we'll summarize this once more. Let me offer another counter evidence 2. We cannot be selective in assigning targets reference. Case in point, Jannah in the Rabwa in point C. A very simple question. Why is Maryam automatically considered to be Jannah A? When we read that ayah, there were Maryam and Ibn of her. Both of them took shelter in a Rabwa. Then either of the two could be called the Jannah in 265. And by extension, either one of them could have been the Jannah, the first Jannah of the janatain. Why have we taken Maryam but not Ibn Maryam? Now I know that a counter argument that could be offered is it had to be Maryam, it could not have been Yahya, because Yahya has been discounted, because there have been other similar linkages that seem to paint him negatively. But considering the counter evidence one, which is what we just talked about before, we have to be careful, extremely wary of making enormous claims simply based on linkages that we select selectively. If we don't get into that infinite regress, and if we remain honest, we've got Maryam and an Ibn of her in a Rabwa. And thus, either of those two could be the Jannah that is being talked about here. كَمَثَلٍ Jannah bi Rabwa. We'll again talk about this more as well. Counter evidence number 3. We don't make bold claims based on assumptions. Case in point, we can't select Zakaria as a Jannah by extension. The Quran, frankly, does not mention Zakaria at all as a Jannah, regardless of his actions. It is tenuous to argue that he too has now become a Jannah because we agree to a pre-agreed upon theory. Just because we have a theory that Maryam was so-and-so, that Yahya was so-and-so, that Eisa ibn Maryam was so-and-so, and if all of that is true, which is what we take it to be true, then when we come into this particular ayah, we are going to say, because of the way that we have structured our argument, that Maryam is one of the Jannah, then the other Jannah has to be Zakaria. This is not solid. This is not a solid foundation. It is a supposition, one that I don't deny straight away. It can have some merit. It allows us to build hypotheses. It allows us to explore these things from different angles, and there's no problem with that. But this is not strong enough evidence in its own right to build a harsh claim against Rasul Eisa ibn Maryam, which is what this particular masal is used to do. So now that we've looked at just 3 counter evidences, 1, 2, and 3, we just went through, how does that impact the argument that was presented that says one of those two rajulain is Eisa ibn Maryam? Well, let's have a look. It was claimed that in 2350, the first ayah, Maryam and a son of hers are an ayah, whether we take them together or individually. I personally agree with that. There's no problem with that. But either which way, it does not lead us to Eisa ibn Maryam in this masal. B. That Maryam took shelter in a Rabwa, 2350. Now again, my personal understanding of this masal and looking at the Quran in this particular contention is that that's fine. There's no problem with that. But once more, as I said before in point number 2, there were 2 people, she and her Ibn, who are both together in this Rabwa. So yes, Maryam was taking shelter in a Rabwa, but she wasn't alone by herself. Here is where we start really breaking down the argument, the claim that was made. Now the claim went that because a Jannah is talked about in a Rabwa, which faced hardship and offered 2 multiples of its fruits, that Jannah is therefore the metaphorical representation of Maryam, thus Jannah A equals Maryam. Now I disagree with that here, based upon all we've seen so far. The mushaf doesn't support that. Looking at 1 and 2, those 2 counterpoints I made before, I argue this is an incorrect assertion, and therefore I would cross it out. Point number D, that because for Maryam, Zakaria was a source of support, thus he too by extension was a Jannah. I disagree with that as well. And we, as we said, we just looked at this one in counter evidence number 3 as well. E. Because of C and D, as in this and that, the janatain mentioned in the ayah are Maryam and Zakaria. I say no. There is no C, there is no D. This can and should be crossed out. We should not force meanings to certain terms. We should not set reference the way we want them to if there's not good, strong support behind them. F. That therefore one of the rajulain is Rasul Eisa ibn Maryam. No, there's no evidence left for that anymore. I haven't quite stopped here. Let me share a few more observations with you as well. Somebody might say that regardless of what you just did, Eisa ibn Maryam, he is one of those two rajulain in this masal because the surah talks of a walad in the very beginning. Well, let's be honest. Just because a term, walad here, is used in the beginning of the surah, it does not necessarily mean that the Eisa or Eisa ibn Maryam, he is the person that's being talked about exclusively in this masal some 20 ayat later. Eisa ibn Maryam, by the way, is not the only son, if you take ibn here instead of walad, in the Quran either of Allah. For example, Yahud, they're the ones calling themselves sons of Allah as well. If you take ibn for now as a child, nahnu abna'ullah. Again, it wasn't Uzair, whoever Uzair is, or whatever Uzair is, wasn't he referred to as the son of Allah as well? Also, walad, قالوا اتخذ الله ولدا. This particular pattern appears 3 times in the Quran. Never once does it explicitly refer to Isa or Eisa ibn Maryam. Yes, I know a credible case can be made that he is referred to there, and I don't have a problem with that. But again, we have to be honest. Just because walad is used in the very beginning of Surah Al-Kahf, 20 plus ayat later, when we find 2 rajulain being talked about, doesn't necessarily mean that one of those 2 now is that walad that was talked about in the beginning of the surah. That is not how we make an argument. Another observation regarding Jannah or Janatain, to be precise. We're going to build on counter evidence 1. It's not the first time that the Quran talks about 2 Jannah or Jannatain or Jannatan. For Saba, there were 2 Jannatan, and they were instructed to consume from both of them. The ayah says, لَقَدْ كَانَ لِسَبَإٍ فِي مَسْكَنِهِمْ آيَةٌ جَنَّتَانِ عَنْ يَمِينٍ وَشِمَالٍ. And certainly for Saba in their masakin there was a sign, Jannatan, 2 Jannat. كُلُوا مِنْ رِزْقِ رَبِّكُمْ. Consume, use, utilize from the rizq of your Lord, and so on. Who are the 2 Jannatan here? If we were to be insisting, just like we did for Rajulain, and if we have to be consistent in the methodology, then just as we said Rajulain should be the same people all across, surely these Jannatan here should be the same people as well. But are these 2 Jannatan or the 2 Jannas that are being referred to, are they Maryam and Zakaria as well? And if they're not, and I know some people would say, no, it kind of changes. Well, if it changes, then the overall theory where we say, because a word or pattern is used in multiple places, it means it talks about the same thing, then that theory, that foundation is weak. We have to accept that fact. You can't have the 2 together. Either you say, as part of that methodology, as part of the working mechanism, or part of making hypotheses, that if I find patterns appearing together and there's a word cloud that seems to go along with it, there's a semantic interlaced system that we always find together, thus it must mean the same thing. If that is the case, you should apply it everywhere. So Jannatain must always be the same Jannatain. The Rajulain must be the same 2 men as well. But if you say that it works in some places but not the other places, well, your first contention, your starting contention is no longer strong enough. I don't think that is. And if we're being honest, I think it's a very apparent thing. We shouldn't be selective as to how we run with this methodology. And this is what I've written down here as well. There's danger if we arbitrarily, and that is what we've done in my opinion, assign them to certain people. If Maryam and Zakaria are the 2 Jannatain in the masal we're looking at, what about these 2 particular ayat? Who are these 2 people? Who are these Jannatain that we're looking at? Does the logic that we use to identify those 2 people for the masal in Surah Al-Kahf work for these 2 situations as well? The more reasonable argument is this. There's a high probability that depending upon the context, the reference to the same term are different in different places. That is, I think, a very reasonable way to look and ponder the Quran or any text out there. I don't think this should be contentable. This is a very valid point. And this is not to discount the other contention that if we find patterns appearing together at different parts of the Quran, then they are interlinked. I think that's valid. But we have to be honest. All that gives us is confidence to start. That is not proof in itself. I'd like to make one more point before I move off of this particular observation. I don't think that the position that I've just talked about, where you take words and you arbitrarily, according to what you want, you apply certain reference to them and say, well, these ones point to that and this one point to that. You can't really argue with that because fundamentally that's a weak foundation. What do I mean by that? Because if you were to argue with them and if you were to pick an example and say, well, Jannah in this masal, why have you picked that to be Maryam and not Ibn of her, say Yahya or Eisa ibn Maryam or whoever? Why have you just picked one? Why not the other? Then the same logic would be used to prove that the other Ibn is not capable of being the Jannah. But that logic would use the same weak principles that we are critiquing in the first place. I hope that point gets through to you, because what we're really talking about here is an infinite regress. We are never going to be able to get out of a discussion where the other party's terms and understanding is based upon their own understanding, which is supported by other terms that are built on the same foundation, and so on. This is a never-ending loop, unfortunately. This is not something that one, I think, can reason with. All I can say is I can see where you've come from. I see that because you had this particular theory in mind, you found that very convenient to superimpose that on this masal, and I can see exactly how your thinking works. But I have objections. Having had those objections, I do respect the fact that you have the right to your opinion. Let's move on from here. I think this is unfortunately all we can get out of this particular observation. Let's continue onto a slightly different topic. An-nakhil, nakhil, nakhilata in the Quran. Well, Allah does not talk to the body of the human. Allah does not talk to what we wear, how we dress, what we do with our physical bodies. It talks to the intellect. It talks to the nafs that we really hold. It is the nafs that the Quran is targeted to, not the body that nafs wears for a little bit of time. We take that into mind. We look at the Quran with fresh eyes. I don't really find fruits or palm trees or grapes or anything like that. So in my understanding so far, and I'll talk about this in great detail, inshallah, going forwards as well, I like to offer a few starting positions for these terms, just so you can see why I've offered these propositions the way I have. What is al-nakhl in the Quran? The overall mafhum, in my understanding, comes and carries these shades. Prominent growth, one that sifts and clears, something that emerges from the earth, a foundation, something that has a solid trunk, towers over the surroundings. An-nakhl may or may not have tala. And I've got a couple of examples there, one example, sorry, in particular, which shows you that there could be an-nakhl that do not have tala. An-nakhl is in al-ard, but it is not, interestingly, associated directly with the Jannah in the Quran. A Jannah can have nakhl, but not an-nakhl. Again, we'll talk about this, inshallah, more when I pick up this topic. An-nakhl in the Quran has no thamar, fruit or produce or harvest mentioned in the Quran. That is only for the nakhil. And I've got a couple of ayats, and why I don't think that those ayat could refer to thamar being associated with an-nakhl. Also, an-nakhl in the Quran, I don't find that to be associated with inab or anab. Nakhil is an instantiation of an-nakhl that has thamar, thimar, produce, results. It can be sinwan in pairs, same family, same grouping, or ghayr sinwan by itself. Jannat can be of nakhil. Nakhil, interestingly, as I was saying before, comes with anab, but not inab. There's precision there. There is an association of nakhil with anab, but not inab. Only time it does come with inab is when it is used by those who refuse to believe. أو تكون لك جنة من نخيل وعنب. Yes, it does come together, nakhil and inab. However, this sentence is being said by people who are wrong, who refuse to believe. So there's a sign of them not understanding how Quran uses its own terms, and them misusing the way Quranic terminology is used by other people apart from them. Nakhla is an instantiation of an-nakhil. No mention of that explicitly of being sinwan or ghayr sinwan. it is mentioned in the Quran as having a solid trunk. Inab and anab, just while we're here, I like to cover these off as well. Inab, all nabat, growth that emerges from the earth that does not have a solid trunk. Now I would like to, if you haven't Googled that before, have a look at palm trees, how they grow and the trunks that they have and how they tower over everything else and how they operate, where basically from the root to the leaf to the fruit, everything of nakhal is useful, compared to anab or inab, which is growth that has a stem but doesn't really have a solid trunk, and it's easier to reach. It's something that you can reach out and grab. So anab in the Quran, coming back to it, is that inab that has thamar. It is something that's easier to reach compared to the fruit of nakhal or nakhil, if you have to be precise. Anab offer their fruits easily. You can go and reach them without making a lot of effort. Again, I'd like to talk about these terms, inshallah, in greater detail as time goes on. Who is this masal for? Well, I said that it is for those who spread peace, have been spreading peace, alladhina amanu. Why do I say that? Let's have a quick look. In the beginning of the surah, we find two groups that are being talked about. The mu'minun, وَيُبَشِّرَ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ الَّذِينَ يَعْمَلُونَ الصَّالِحَاتِ. And it's also, the surah is talking about those who make up lies against or upon Allah. وَيُنذِرْ الَّذِينَ قَالُوا اتَّخَذَ اللَّهُ وَلَدًا مَا لَهُمْ بِهِ مِنْ عِلْمٍ وَلَا لِآبَائِهِمْ كَبُرَتْ كَلِمَةً تَخْرُجُ مِنْ أَفْوَاهِهِمْ إِنْ يَقُولُونَ إِلَّا كَذِبًا. These are strong words about those who make up lies against Allah. But if we go look at this particular masal, just before this masal starts, the people that are being talked about are إِنَّ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ. Those who are spreading peace, doing good deeds, something about them, and the ayat go on. So personally, I believe at this point that this masal is for these people. But what's really interesting is that point is neither here nor there. Even if you were to take lahum in the very first ayah of this masal to be pointing to the mu'minun or these people, the really bad people, the takeaway of the masal doesn't change. We'll talk about the takeaways. I think those takeaways are generic enough for everybody, so it doesn't really make a difference. Right, so having covered, I'd say probably one of the meatiest questions of this masal, we're going to go through the rest, and hopefully it'll be a lot quicker than the first ayah. I'll again talk about, and you'll see why, some of the other contentions in that theory I don't think are quite right. But we'll talk about them as we come to those ayat. Let's go to the second ayah. So ayah 2 of 13. Person A owes his status to Allah. Through him he has a system that works like clockwork. He also has a way to propagate, export the results. كِلْتَا الْجَنَّتَيْنِ آتَتْ أُكُلَهَا وَلَمْ تَظْلِمْ مِنْهُ شَيْئًا وَفَجَّرْنَا خِلَالَهُمَا نَهَرًا. Both of these veiled heavens produced their results, and neither did any wrong in that. And we spread through these two a vibrant channel. Let's talk about the propositions. Number 1, ukulaha does not refer to the actual produce of a fruit garden. 2, person A, the first rajul, received benefits from the two heavens without any issue. 3, the results got channeled to the outside world through that nahar. Number 4, person A had a finely running system that worked without fail, had a solid structure, a way of constantly replenishing it, and a transport mechanism for those outside. 5, reminder from Allah once more, just like the last ayah, that the janatain and the structure and the replenishment and the channel were all through him and his forces. It wasn't person A's doing. Quick observation about nahar. Nahar, the way I've understood this, is a channel that is vivacious, is lively, it's got results, it flows from a source. Interestingly, it's not necessarily a good thing in the Quran. For example, in this particular ayah, when Talut is traveling with his junood, there's talk about a nahar, which let's just say is not a nahar that you should be drinking from. What is also interesting is that in this ayah, one nahar is talked about and not al-anhar. For example, this very famous pattern, janatain tajri min tahtiha al-anhar, that is not used in here. Let's go on to ayah number 3. In this ayah, we now get the first glimpse of person A's character and his state of mind. after he has been in control of his perfect system for a while, gaining all the while through it. The ayah goes, وَكَانَ لَهُ ثَمَرٌ فَقَالَ لِصَاحِبِهِ وَهُوَ يُحَاوِرُهُ أَنَا أَكْثَرُ مِنْكَ مَالًا وَأَعَزُّ نَفَرًا. And for him there was a harvest. Then he said to his companion, the second man, engaged in discussions with him, the first man, I am greater than you possession-wise and stronger in numbers. Propositions. Number 1. Person A had thamar, results harvest through his system. 2. Thamar refers to what person A gained through the janatain instead of the thamar of the janatain. Absorb that, let that sink in if you need to. Number 3. Person A and person B knew each other from before and they've been having similar discussions. Person 4. Before I go on, I say this because وَهُوَ يُحَاوِرُهُ. There is no linguistic value at all if he said that means the same thing as qala. If he already said something, we could have cut off that section and that would have made no difference. وَهُوَ يُحَاوِرُهُ. That has been going on for a while, to and fro between them. Number 4. Person A boasts and considers himself powerful based on his possessions and people he's rallied around him. 5. Person A shows no appreciation, acknowledgement to the ones who gave him this system and the resulting thamar. Nafara, the only time nafara is used in the Quran is in 2 references to jinn who listened to the Quran. It's something I'd like to explore further when I pick up the topic of jinn in the Quran. وَإِذْ صَرَفْنَا إِلَيْكَ نَفَرًا مِنَ الْجِنِّ يَسْتَمِعُونَ الْقُرْآنَ. Thamar, again just a little pointer. Quran uses thamar, thamarah and thamarat. Again, we have to be careful what they refer to. They're not physical objects that were present in the 7th century Arabia, nor are they synonyms talking about the same thing, just in different words, like we saw for an-nakhl and nakhil and nakhla. Let's continue on. Ayah number 4 is where finally the Quran now gives person A a title, that of being a zalim. وَدَخَلَ جَنَّتَهُ. We'll talk about this. وَدَخَلَ جَنَّتَهُ وَهُوَ ظَالِمٌ لِنَفْسِهِ قَالَ مَا أَظُنُّ أَن تَبِيدَ هَذِهِ أَبَدًا. And he entered his veiled haven, having done wrong as a wrongdoer to himself. He said, I don't think that this veiled haven of mine will ever perish. Propositions. Number 1. Depending on the context, the Jannah being talked about can be different. Now this is kind of what we talked about up in the comment section when we looked at the first ayah as well. Number 2. Person, and this is really important, person A chose to enter his own Jannah, his own veiled haven, one that he had created for himself according to what he wanted. Jannatahu, his Jannah. I'm reasonably certain about this. This is a much more compelling understanding than ascribing Jannatahu as one of the 2 Jannat that person A possessed. Or the alternative of, or let's now abruptly suggest that the text is now referring to person B who now has a Jannah, even though that was not mentioned at all by the Quran. In the same vein, proposition number 3, Jannatahu does not refer to person B possessing 1 Jannah. Now, unless one comes to this ayah with a preconceived notion, with a thesis that they already have in their mind, I don't find much evidence for person B as the one who has the 1 Jannah that is being referred to in this particular ayah. It doesn't make sense to me. I'm sorry, it just doesn't. Point number 4. Person A is now called a zalim, a wrongdoer, and we now have a few reasons. A. He created his own Jannah, his own worldview, haven, in opposition to the 2 Jannatain he had from Allah. B. Ignoring, belittling the role of Allah and His forces in giving him the resources that had empowered him. C. For doing an incorrect dhan, ascribing immortality to his own construction. 5. Person A was from a distinguished dhurriya tradition, one of those whose ibads were given the Al-Kitab. I'll talk about this on the right hand side. Number 6. Person A's Jannah, his personal Jannah, was influenced by his taking pride in being part of a distinguished dhurriya tradition of those ibad who were given the Al-Kitab. We'll talk about this on the right hand side, which I'll just move over to now. dhan. But in the Quran, it's an observation, having or doing the act of dhan is not by default a wrong thing. Now this is unlike how we might use this in Urdu or even in Arabic sometimes. الَّذِينَ يَظُنُّونَ أَنَّهُمْ مُلَاقُو رَبِّهِمْ. It's not necessarily a bad dhan to have. إِنِّي ظَنَنْتُ أَنِّي مُلَاقٍ حِسَابِيَةٍ. So dhan by itself is not a wrong thing to do. It's wrong when you do it for a wrong thing, or you have the wrong dhan, or for wrong reasons. ظَالِمْ لِنَفْسِهِ. Now interestingly, only 2 times in the Quran do we find this pattern appear, and both of those times, except for this particular instance, it refers to those of a distinguished dhurriya, those who were given the Al-Kitab or the law. And I've got those 2 instances written up here for you. Now, building on those counter evidences that I talked about before, because we have a pattern, we have things that are being linked together, we have a great starting position to start linking those ayat together, divorcing what views we already have. But this is a starting position, and this is not firm evidence in itself. And specifically, if I was to say and make a fantastic claim that because I've got وَظَالِمْ لِنَفْسِهِ appearing here, and I've got this appearing there, and it's talking about those who were given the Al-Kitab, and it's talking about dhurriya of some really important people, then this rajul is also part of this, and as a result, something's going to happen to him that is really, really terrible, and I've got complete certainty of that. That is going too far. That is going too far. You really need to support those contentions. They have to be rock solid, and I don't think that Eisa ibn Maryam in this masal is a theory that is really robust. Let's continue on. Ayah number 5. Now person A now makes the worst possible mistake of them all, competing against Allah through his own mortal construction. Why do I say that? The ayah says, وَمَا أَظُنُّ السَّاعَةَ قَائِمَةً وَلَئِنْ رُدِدْتُ إِلَىٰ رَبِّي لَأَجِدَنَّ خَيْرًا مِنْهَا مُنْقَلَبًا. And I don't think that the as-sa'a is established or in play. And surely if I was returned to my Rabb, most certainly I'll find better than it, my Jannah, returned. Proposition number 1. Person A's mental state shows a person at the end of his negative transformation, one who has convinced himself that even when he loses, he actually wins. We find those people all the time around us. 2. Person A considers himself a better creator than Allah and his forces. 3. The Quran ties person A's mind frame to the Al-Insan, the prototype that's often chided in the Quran, who behaves likewise. I'll talk about this on the right hand side as well. 4. Person A makes more mistakes now. He elevates his own construction framework haven over what Allah has promised. He now has an incorrect dhan that the sa'a is not going to get established, and he is now ascribing to Allah a self-made claim that had no sultan authority from him. Number 5. Person A shared other negative attributes of the Al-Insan chided in the Quran as well. I'm calling it probable, and I'll talk about this to the right. Number 6. Person A began corrupting his thamar, fruit, through his Jannah. Again, we'll talk about this and when we come to the later ayat on this masal. Sa'a. Now that is a topic that I like to talk about and cover separately, so I'll leave it for now. As-sa'a qa'ima. This is, again, an interesting pattern in the Quran. That is often used for the Al-Insan, the kind of being, the prototype that tends to make mistakes and is weak. Got a couple of those examples in there. Insan, or the Al-Insan in the Quran, is a really interesting prototype, is a really interesting variable that we find used to often carry negative features, negative attributes. For example, we find Al-Insan to be weak, unjust, hasty, argumentative, excessive. خُلِقَ الْإِنسَانُ ضَعِيفًا. Insan was made to be weak, ضعيفا. He is often kafur, he is often in a hurry. He can become, or he thinks that he is an enemy. He likes to argue. He is excessive. So again, this is something I like to talk about more as time goes on as well. Again, the argument being that, yes, we can find patterns, yes, they do hold together, but we should be very careful as to what we derive from these surface level, these linkages that we see up front. Let's continue on to ayah number 6. Person A here is now recognized as a kafir by person B. Things are really progressing here. قال له صاحبه وهو يحاوره أكفرت بالذي خلقك من تراب ثم من نطفة ثم سواك رجلا. Then said to him, the first man, his companion, the second man, engaged in discussions with him, did you willingly deny the one who created you from turab, then from nutfa, then fashioned you as one with authority? Propositions. Number 1. Person B continued to reason with person A. Now I'm saying this because we find the same term appearing here as well. وَهُوَ يُحَاوِرُهُ. So it's not like this is happening straight away, one after the other, but there are discussions that are happening behind the scenes, and we are getting time jumps, so to speak, in between this and the other scene we just looked at before. And by the way, this is also the attribute of one, person B, who keeps reminding in the name of Allah in his system. This is what we should all be doing all the time as well. Proposition number 2. Person A is accused of having done kufr, knowingly rejecting what he has received. Now, even if he were to stick to surface level meanings, this is what the mafhum is. It's not really changing. Now, made you from turab, then from nutfa. We have to be really specific here that this is not pointing to one person only, i.e. Eisa ibn Maryam. I know the argument has been made that because turab and nutfa is being used, and that was the same thing that was said to Eisa ibn Maryam as well, then it is the same person. No, we have to be really careful, and we shouldn't be hasty or selective in how we choose to make these linkages, because we find هُوَ الَّذِي خَلَقَكُمْ مِنْ تُرَابٍ ثُمَّ مِنْ نُطْفَةٍ. The same thing is being talked about to all of us as well. Now, we were all also made from turab and from nutfa. Just because we find this also being talked about one particular Isa, who is an instance of khalaqakum, the superset. He is one part of the superset. Thus, it doesn't necessarily mean that in this particular ayah, the person that's being talked about as having done this particular act is Eisa ibn Maryam. I don't think that argument holds. Let's continue on to the next ayah. Ayah 7 of 13. Person A is called a mushrik as well. لَكِنَّا هُوَ اللَّهُ رَبِّي وَلَا أُشْرِكُ بِرَبِّي أَحَدًا. But we, the two of us, He is Allah, my Rabb, Lord, and I don't associate anyone with my Rabb. Propositions. Number 1. Person B accuses A of sharing opinions, processes, systems with Allah Himself. Number 2. This is really interesting. Person A's ilah is himself. His ilah is himself. He has rebelled against Allah by elevating himself alongside Allah. Number 3. There is a connection between this masal and what goes on in Surah Al-Jinn. I'll go to the right hand side. Surah Jinn. I found something really interesting happening in there, and I haven't been able to crack this yet, but the more and more I dig, I find patterns that I find appearing in no other place except for this particular surah. Is there a connection? At this point, I don't know. But as I said in the very beginning, I'm presenting what I found so far, and hopefully there are areas, avenues for research for other people who'd like to pick this up as time goes on as well. I'd like to make one more point as well. Argument has been made that up until this masal, the conversation was happening between two people, person A, person B. But suddenly here, the scene changes. Suddenly it changes. And now the talk is with Nabi Muhammad. Nabi Muhammad is all of a sudden here, without any warning, abruptly having a chat with his qareen. Again, a term that has been ascribed in a similar methodology that we've seen so far being critiqued. That Nabi Muhammad is the one who's now in conversation with something, some being within himself. And now this talk and some of the ayat that continue on are between Nabi Muhammad and Eisa ibn Maryam. I frankly find this really hard to justify or understand. If I'm being really honest, the text has offered us no reason to suggest that these are parenthetical instructions for the first recipient of this mushaf or for others. It just doesn't do that. Instead, I would argue, with all respect, that by forcibly breaking these ayat from the preceding ayat, ends up changing the meaning of this masal to suit a pre-selected, pre-liked theory. This is serious stuff. We should be really careful if there's no good reason, we should have overwhelming evidence to override what is really obvious. So no, I don't think that the scene has shifted here at all. It is the same conversation that is happening between person A and person B. Let's continue on to the next ayah. Here, person B is chiding person A. وَلَوْلَا إِذْ دَخَلْتَ جَنَّتَكَ قُلْتَ مَا شَاءَ اللَّهُ لَا قُوَّةَ إِلَّا بِاللَّهِ إِن تَرَنِي أَنَا أَقَلَّ مِنْكَ مَالًا وَوَلَدًا. And why not? When you had entered your veiled haven, you had said, as long as wills, designs allows Allah. No power except with Allah. Even if you consider me lesser than you possession-wise or followers-wise, who you have birthed in your image. What do I mean by that? Let's have a look at that. Proposition number 1. This is really interesting. Person B is kind of repeating the same words that person A said, but he changes the term. He now uses the term walad instead of nafar, because he recognizes that person A hasn't just attracted followers, but those who are identical to him in their mistaken worldview. So he is birthing walad, awlad in a way. Proposition number 2. Person B is a wise entity, person, force, which continues to argue with reason and wisdom. Number 3. Person A has joined the group of people who stop growing because they convinced themselves they reached the summit. I'll talk about this on the right hand side as well. Number 4. Person A has begun producing others in his own image, and that is why he is now being called with a slightly different language by person B. Number 5. Jannah of person A could have stayed blessed as long as he had maintained his relationship with Allah. Very likely. Because end of the day, we all create a Jannah in our own minds. What matters is whether it aligns to the Quranic ideals or not. MashaAllah in the note section. MashaAllah versus Insha'Allah versus Ma'aradallah versus Qadr. I like to talk about these things. What is Mashiach? What is Dua? Can we change fates by saying words? Is this what the Quran teaches us? I like to talk about this more, so I'll park this for now. Those who refuse to see. Now this is a group of people that we see repeatedly talked about in the Quran over and over. Those people get to a point where they refuse to see what is wrong. They're so well entrenched in their worldviews that they refuse to grow. They refuse to see past their mistakes. They think they're perfect. That is when the downfall starts. So this masal so far is presenting person A, whether it's a force within us or a real person, as one who starts off well but loses his way. The saddest thing obviously is that this force or this person, it kind of seals his path, his destination, when he says, that's it, I'm not going to go any further. And this ayah I've quoted in here is just one of many where we find the warnings, clear warnings being given to those when they decide thus. Walad versus ibn, walid versus ab. Again, I like to talk about these terms as time goes on as well. Let's go on to the next ayah, ayah 9 of 13. A reminder is given of consequences. Nothing lasts, no matter how great, unless it's maintained by Allah. فَعَسَى رَبِّي أَن يُؤْتِينَا خَيْرًا مِنْ جَنَّتِكَ وَيُرْسِلَ عَلَيْهَا حُسْبَانًا مِنَ السَّمَاءِ فَتُصْبِحْ سَعِيدًا زَلَقًا. Then it could be that my Rabb gives me better than your veiled heaven, and sends over it, your Jannah, a reckoning from the lofty source. Then it, your Jannah, becomes a slippery climb. Let's look at the two propositions that I've got here. Number 1, person B has not received any Jannah, at least up until this point in the story. Number 2, person B recognizes and warns of a reckoning, consequences for person A's actions. Just a couple of points before I move on to the next ayah. La'alla versus asa. I think these are very interesting terms in the Quran that I'd like to explore more as time goes on. Husban. Husban on the wazn for alan, other words in the Quran on the same wazn, Qurban, Furqan, Ghufran, Sultan, etc. Not one time do I find the form changing to change the meaning far away from its root. Husban, a single noun derived from hasaba, which is to calculate, reckon, bound. One example here as well. The Ash-Shams and Al-Qamar as a husban, calculation, reckoning, bounding. Let's go on to the next ayah. Ayah 10 or 13. This here is a final warning of what's to come if person A doesn't change his actions. أو يصبح ماؤها غورا فلن تستطيع له طلبا. Or that its life force becomes lost, hollows out, then you won't have the ability for requesting it, the ma. Number 1. Through incorrect actions, one's source of strength either becomes difficult to cling on to or loses its vigor entirely. It's a life lesson. 2. In the end, one runs out of time to even seek to right his wrongs. Let's go on to the next ayah. Ayah number 11 of 13. The end of an ilah, one that was set up beside Allah and his minions. وَأُحِيطَ بِثَمَرِهِ فأصبح يقلب كفيه على ما أنفق فيها وهي خاوية على عروشها ويقول يا ليتني لم أشرك بربي أحدا. And his harvest fruits was surrounded, encircled, constrained. Then he began flipping his hands over what he had done, as in what he had spent on it, his Jannah, a hollow worldview perspective. And he says, I wish I hadn't elevated with Allah's opinion decisions anyone. Number 1. There is no immortality to be gained through followers, fruits gathered the wrong way. Now, this is obvious, this is certain. This is the Sunnatullah. Thamarihi huna here refers to his thamar, those that he had gathered through his control of the ma from the two janatain channeled through the nahar shaped by his own corrupt Jannah. 2. His thamar, person A's thamar, was constrained, unsuccessful, because the worldview their works were founded on, that was hollow. 3. In the end, when time has run out, one realizes his mistakes. Let's go on to the next ayah. 12 of 13. Failure does not attract company. Sad as it is, when you fail, you are by yourself. وَلَمْ تَكُنْ لَهُ فِئَةٌ يَنْصُرُونَهُ مِنْ دُونِ اللَّهِ وَمَا كَانَ مُنْتَصِرًا. And there wasn't for him a party who could have helped him without Allah, nor was he one who could assist. Number 1. Person A's end was as one who had no help from anyone. And the last ayah for today. True support only comes from Allah. هُنَالِكَ الْوَلَايَةُ لِلَّهِ الْحَقِّ هُوَ خَيْرٌ ثَوَابًا وَخَيْرٌ عُقْبًا. Here for you, the support is for Allah, the truth to give. He is the best in rewarding and best requital. No support is truer than what comes from Allah. So we've gone through this masal. We've talked about some of the takeaways as part of a discussion already. Look at some of the warnings of what not to do, and we've also critiqued a particular view that I think wasn't quite well founded. We talked about this all. If we come back to the original question that we started this video with, what was the purpose? What are the takeaways from this masal? I think there are quite a few. But I'd like to offer a few that come to my mind straight away. And I think this is also an answer to those who might say, or who might have wondered, including me in the very beginning when I started this, as to what is this masal doing in Surah Al-Kahf? What is the value of this? There are two people who go about into a garden, they're talking about, I've got this, I've got that. Well, what does it mean to us? Whether they were true people, real people or not, how does that apply to us? There are takeaways, and we've already, as I said, gone through them. But let's try and take maybe 4 most important takeaways, or at least the 4 most important in my eyes. Number 1, don't let success get to your head. Number 2, don't forget where you came from. Number 3, remember where you're going. Number 4, remind others when you see them go wrong. These are pretty universal lessons. These are lessons that we can take and apply on pretty much on a daily basis. Don't become arrogant. Don't forget your roots. Don't forget where you're headed. To every action you do, there is a consequence. Don't forget that. These are golden principles that the Quran is reiterating for us. But also the same point. If we do go wrong, hopefully there is someone around us. There's this positive energy, even whether from ourselves or from outside, that is drawing us away from getting wrong. Listen to it. Listen, heed to what is being told to you. Or if you are that person for someone else, remain like person B. Continue to help person A. Might be that they'll see where they've gone wrong. Maybe they'll turn around before it's too late. Those Those 4 takeaways, I think, are an awesome way for one who ponders on the Quran to say, Allah is reminding me how to be a better human, how to develop my nafs, how to develop my intellect, so I connect better with the divine. There are a few meta lessons that I thought we should talk about as well before we wrap up. Number 1, we should be very wary of extraordinary claims being made, especially when they depend on pre-agreed, pre-liked theories. Number 2, the Quran is dynamic. Its meanings are not tied to any one person's personal fahm. The Quran has got this richness of context and understanding based upon who is the one who's researching, thinking, pondering, and where those lessons are being applied. And that is the beauty of the Quran. The masal that we just looked at, for example, you can apply it in so many different ways. Why do we have to force it down a specific perspective only and deny everything else that comes our way? That is not how I think we should deal with the Quran and its universality, its dynamism that it offers to those who ponder its ayat. And because of that, I believe that the names of these 2 rajul, these rajulain, they've been left blank on purpose. So we, you and I, we can fill them in depending upon the circumstances that we find ourselves in. Sometimes we will be the person A, sometimes we'll be the person B. But hopefully there's somebody around us, if we become A, that'll say, hey, get out of this. Don't let that success get to your head. Remember where you came from. Remember where you're going. And if you see someone around you go wrong, you remind them as well. And lastly, you would have noticed that there are quite a few terms that I either didn't talk about or I offered straight up my limitations. I think it's really important to not let oneself be stopped from understanding or pondering the Quran, because if you were to wait for one day where you say, oh, I can now begin to think over the Quran and start pondering and engaging it because I've got all the knowledge, well, guess what? You'll never start. You'll never get anywhere. The key, I think this is, again, part of this very masal. I think the lesson that we need to take away from this is that so long we acknowledge our limits, where we've come from, we should remain honest and sincere. Whatever Jannah we build for ourselves, however which way we nourish it and we grow it, let's not forget where we came from. Let's remember that there's a path in front of us, that we're constantly moving, that we are not stuck in the place that we are at. And keeping that in mind, remaining honest and sincere, continue to ponder the Quran. Let's not become person A who at a certain point in his journey stops and says no more. No matter which level you are, study the Quran. With that, until the next time, Assalamu alaikum.